The train came before sunrise. Its whistle cut through the still dark of central Texas like a blade, long, hollow and unfamiliar. People woke to it. Farmers paused in their barns. The depot platform filled with quiet figures in work clothes and Sunday hats. Word had spread. The prisoners were coming. At 700, the first cars rolled into Hearn. Flat open fields surrounded the tracks. Fields that had never seen Europe, but would now hold its ghosts. The guards stood ready, rifles slung, but not raised. The air was thick with heat, cicadas, and the scent of creosote from new lumber. When the doors opened, they expected monsters. Instead, they saw boys. The first German PS to set foot in Texas stepped into the morning light. Blinking, gaunt, and sunburnt. Many still wore the khaki of the Afrika Korps. Boots scuffed to ruin from Tunisian sand. Their insignias were faded, their movements quiet, too orderly, too tired to threaten anyone. One of them, barely 20, looked around at the horizon. A flat, endless expanse unlike anything he'd ever seen. He muttered to another in German, "So much sky. We are nowhere." A Texas guard overheard but didn't answer. He simply motioned toward the trucks waiting beyond the station. Locals whispered as the column passed. "They don't look mean," one woman said. Another replied, "They looked mean enough in the papers." For the residents of Hearn, the war had always been a thing of headlines and ration books. Europe was far away, a blur of names, like Tobruk and Stalingrad. But that morning, the front line arrived, wearing dust, chains, and polite silence. 2 miles north of town, barbed wire glinted under the rising sun. Behind it stood neat rows of wooden barracks, brand new, smelling of pine and paint. Guard towers framed the perimeter, more symbolic than threatening. Inside the wire, the U.S. Army had built something remarkable. A small city designed for captivity. Camp Hearn could hold 4,800 prisoners. It had its own hospital, bakery, theater, chapel, and library. The prisoners would eat American rations, receive mail from home, and work for 80 cents a day, all under the Geneva Convention. As the gates closed behind them, a single sound carried across the camp, the clatter of boots on gravel. The rhythmic precision of German discipline still intact. No guns fired, no orders shouted. The war had changed form. It was no longer fought in smoke and steel, but in the quiet tension between captor and captive, between duty and decency. The day the Germans arrived in Texas, no one cheered, no one cried. They simply watched, wondering how enemies could look so human. In a world burning on both sides of the ocean, this was something new, a front without blood. And yet within those fences, the war would continue silently, psychologically, with rules written not in strategy, but in morality. September 12, 1943. The day the war came home to Texas. Before that day, the people of Texas believed they knew what enemy meant. Newspapers had painted the Germans as savage, unrelenting, iron machines in human form. The posters showed them with claws, teeth, helmets like horns. To most Americans, the word Nazi meant the same thing as monster. And now, the monsters had arrived in boxcars. In the summer of 1943, when word spread that prisoners of war would be shipped into the American heartland, local towns protested. Politicians warned of sabotage, escape, and terror. "We don't want Hitler's army in our backyard," one headline read. But the war didn't care about fear. It cared about logistics. America had captured too many men to keep in Europe. The deserts of North Africa had surrendered entire armies, and the British camps were overflowing. The United States had to take them somewhere vast, safe, and far from any front. Texas checked every box. Open land, hot climate, and miles from any coast. Still, the first reaction from ordinary Americans was disbelief. We feed our own soldiers with rations. One farmer said. Now we're supposed to feed theirs too. They expected defiance, violence, fanaticism. They braced for escape attempts, swastika salutes, or hatred. The guards trained for it too. Barbed wire was triple layered. Towers were manned day and night. Orders were clear. No fraternization. But when the gates opened, nothing happened. No riots, no shouting. Just tired men folding blankets, standing for roll call. Saluting the guards out of habit, not ideology. The prisoners themselves carried their own misconceptions. Believed they were being shipped to forced labor camps, or worse, to execution. They'd been told by Nazi propaganda that Americans were barbarians who mutilated prisoners and left them to starve. Then they arrive in Texas and were handed soap, towels, and bread. Private Carl Mueller, captured in Tunisia, later wrote in his diary, "They gave us meat. But not tasted meat in months." The surprise went both ways. The Americans found themselves guarding men who looked and acted just like them, sunburned farm boys from another flag. They were disciplined, polite, even grateful. In the evenings, when the guards smoked by the fence, German voices drifted through the wire. Songs about home, about mothers, about rivers and forests. The same songs the guards' own grandparents might have known. And yet, beneath the civility, unease lingered. These men had worn the eagle and the swastika. They had fought under a banner that promised domination. Some still believed in it. Others had already stopped believing in anything. In one letter intercepted by censors, AP wrote, "It is strange. They treat us better than we treated the French. It confuses the men." What neither side realized yet was that Camp Hearn wasn't built just to hold prisoners. It was built as an experiment, a test of America's ability to conquer not just armies, but hatred itself. The real battle would not be fought with rifles. It would be fought with patience, with discipline, with the uneasy question, what happens when enemies start to see each other as men? And that battle, quiet, moral, and mathematical, was about to begin. By the summer of 1943, the war in North Africa had ended in a silence filled with prisoners. In May alone, over 250,000 Axis troops surrendered in Tunisia. Germans, Italians, even Austrians and Czechs pressed into Hitler's army. The British camps overflowed. The Americans, newly victorious, faced a logistical problem of staggering size. Where do you put 250,000 captured soldiers? Europe was full. The battlefront was moving north towards Sicily and Italy. The U.S. Army needed distance, a place impossible to escape from, impossible to confuse with home. They needed open land, cheap labor, and safety from invasion. They chose America itself. By late summer, troop transports no longer carried just soldiers to Europe. They brought prisoners back. Ships that had carried tanks and munitions across the Atlantic now returned full of captured men. The first large groups departed from Iran, Ailers, and Casablanca, escorted by destroyers through U-boat waters. Aboard, the PS were silent, seasick, and stunned. Most had never seen the open ocean before. They had fought in deserts, not waves. Days stretched into weeks, the air thick with diesel and fear. Some whispered that they were being taken to their deaths. Others prayed they were being taken anywhere but back to the front. When the ships reached America, Newport News, Norfolk, and New York, their passengers stared at the docks in disbelief. There were no ruins, no bomb craters, just cars, people, and abundance. The world they'd been told was collapsing looked untouched. From the ports, trains carried them inland, westward, through forests, mountains, and plains, past towns where children waved, unaware they were waving at the enemy. Texas became the final destination not out of mercy but mathematics. It had what the Army needed: space, railroads, and climate similar to North Africa. Miles of scrubland could be fenced for pennies. The land itself was its own guard. Construction began that spring. Hearn, Camp Bowie, Camp Swift, Camp Huntsville, each designed like a miniature base. Wooden barracks in long rows, water towers, electric lights, mesh halls, hospitals. The U.S. government paid local contractors to build them fast. Within months, Texas had a network of 70 camps surrounded by smaller branch sites where prisoners would later work the fields. Every blueprint followed the Geneva Convention of 1929. To the letter, the rules were clear. Prisoners must be fed equal to U.S. troops, housed in sanitary conditions, and allowed to correspond with family. They would be paid for labor 80 cents a day in script, exchangeable at camp canteens. The policy wasn't kindness. It was strategy. Washington wanted proof that democracy could win not just by killing, but by example. Inside the camps, American efficiency replaced German order. Man registered, photographed, and classified by ideology, loyal Nazi, neutral or anti-Nazi. Each camp held its own chain of command, where German officers maintained discipline under U.S. oversight. By autumn, the numbers had become astonishing. Over 425,000 Axis prisoners in the United States, 50,000 in Texas alone. It was one of the largest forced migrations in modern history, and almost no one in Europe knew it was happening. The war's geography had inverted itself. The Reich's soldiers were now harvesting crops in the same country whose bombers burned their cities. In a diary found years later, 1P wrote, "We expected punishment. We found order. We expected. We found routine." The strangest thing is how easily one forgets which side of the wire he belongs to. And as the war turned eastward toward Italy in the Pacific, Texas became a quiet mirror of its contradictions, a land of freedom ringed with fences, where mercy became a weapon sharper than fear. The war was no longer just about destruction. It was now about control of people, of information, and of conscience. War is made of numbers. Bodies, rations, miles, calories, and captivity is no different. The United States built an entire mathematical system for handling its enemies, and Texas became its center of gravity. 425,000. That was the number of Axis POWs held across America by the end of 1945. The population of a small city turned into a quiet army behind fences. 50,273. That's how many were scattered across Texas alone, more than any other state. Camps dotted the map. From the pine forests of Huntsville to the flat plains of Hereford, from Camp Bowie near Brownwood to the long hot barracks of Hearn. Each could hold thousands. Was built to standard military specification down to the inches of its barbed wire. 240, that was the average number of labor days each prisoner worked per year. Not punishment, but productivity, not vengeance, but value. The Geneva Convention allowed labor so long as it did not serve military purposes. America took that clause and turned it into a supply chain. 1 million estimated U.S. labor hours replaced by PS. In 1944 alone, cotton, peanuts, wheat, lumber, and railroad ties, all touched by men who had once carried rifles for the Reich. Each number had a moral weight. The irony was sharp. German soldiers working Texas fields while young Americans bled in Normandy. In a war fought for destruction, captivity had become construction. At Camp Hearn, the Army ran its daily operations like a ledger. Schman received 3 meals totaling 3,000 calories, a bunk, a uniform, and a weekly wage of 80 cents in canteen script. They could buy cigarettes, razor blades, or paper for letters home. Everything was recorded, measured, accounted for. The prisoners called it Ohne Blut, the war without blood. The U.S. saw it differently. To the War Department, each P is an equation in logistics and morale. Feed him and keep him busy. A bored prisoner is a dangerous prisoner. An occupied one is a solved problem. They worked the land that fed the nation. At the height of harvest, 7,000 German prisoners picked cotton in Texas fields that stretched farther than they could see. Farmers watched them from tractors, rifles slung over shoulders more out of habit than need. And something unexpected happened. The work humanized both sides. The farmers who once feared Hitler's men began to see tired young faces under the Texas sun. The PS-ing cruelty found routine and even respect. Yet the system was not free of calculation. For every humane gesture, there was arithmetic behind it. Labor quotas, supply consumption, guard ratios. The war machine measured humanity the same way it measured fuel, by volume, efficiency, and return. A report from the War Department in 1944 summed it coldly. Prisoners contribute to agricultural stability equivalent to 14% of the local wartime workforce. 14%. Not soldiers, not enemies, labor. Still, the results spoke louder than the reports. Escape attempts were almost non-existent. Fewer than 1% of Texas PS? Not because of fear, but futility. There was nowhere to go. The land itself was the wall, flat, endless, and foreign. The most successful escape in Texas lasted 3 days. The man was caught trying to trade his watch for a meal in Waco. Titled his captors, the desert here is bigger than Africa. Not chains, but distance. Not force, but emptiness. Every number proved the same thing. Captivity in Texas worked because it didn't feel like victory. It felt like control. The war that had begun with invasion now thrived on organization. Behind every sunrise over those barbed wire grids lay an equation that made the impossible seem natural. 425,000 prisoners, 0 revolts, and 1 country that turned enemy soldiers into farm. That was the quiet, perfect efficiency of the American war machine, its most human and its most unsettling success. October 1943, the first harvest season of the war in Texas. The sky above Robertson County burned, white with heat. Cotton fields stretched past the horizon, heavy with fiber that needed picking. Local farmers were desperate. Their sons were gone to Europe and the Pacific. Their daughters worked in factories. There were not enough hands left to keep the fields alive. Then the trucks came. Army green, dust-covered, filled with German PS and faded uniforms. The farmers watched in silence as guards opened the tailgates. Out stepped 40 men, sunburned and silent. Lieutenant Robert Stokes, the officer in charge of Camp Hearn's labor detachment, walked ahead with his clipboard. The workers today, he told the farmers. Treat them as such. We'll handle discipline. The men were divided into teams and sent into the rows. At first they moved awkwardly, bent backs, unused to this kind of labor. A few muttered in German. Others just stared at the endless white of the cotton. But within an hour they fell into rhythm. The heat was merciless. The guards stood under the same sun, rifles slung, sweat pooling under their helmets. One farmer's wife brought out a bucket of water for the soldiers and hesitated when she saw the prisoners watching. Then she carried it forward anyway. A German stepped up, nodded politely, and drank. Dona he. The woman blinked, unsure whether to answer. Finally, she said, "Welcome." That was the moment the field changed. By noon, the Texans and the Germans were talking through gestures, hands pointing, tools shared, laughter. Over broken English. The guards lowered their rifles. The prisoners started humming an old tune, half marching. Rhythm, half memory of home. Private Hans Becker, a 22-year-old captured at Tunis, worked quietly beside a U.S. soldier who had once been a mechanic. Becker watched as the man's shirt clung. with sweat. Hotter than Africa, Becker said softly. The soldiers smirked. They worked side by side until sundown. The guards loaded the prisoners back onto the trucks. Before leaving, Becker walked to one of the farmers and handed him a small object, a silver pocket. "You dropped this," he said in halting English. The man took it, surprised. It had been missing for 2 days. He looked at Becker, then at the guards, unsure what to say. "Appreciate that," he finally murmured. Back at Camp Hearn, the reports came in. Incidents, full quotas met, work completed ahead of schedule, efficiency achieved through dignity. But under the surface, the psychological tension grew. The U.S. Army had not expected friendliness. The rules forbade fraternization, yet cooperation was inevitable. Both sides were trapped in the same monotony, separated only by wire and flag. The U.S. had learned the faces of their guards. The guards had learned the names of their captives. The mess halls, American cooks noticed how the Germans always stood when an officer entered. Still soldiers, even in captivity. The camp orchestra, made from scrap instruments, began performing concerts on weekends. Texans came to listen from outside the fences. Evening, Lieutenant Stokes wrote in his log. "They sing in the same tones our boys might. It's strange to hear the enemy make music while our men are dying overseas. But it's stranger still that it sounds like peace." For the PS, each day of labor was a contradiction. They had lost a war but gained safety. They were prisoners yet free from bombs and fear. For the Americans, the contradiction was moral. How could mercy coexist with vengeance? How do you hate a man who looks like you, works like you, thanks you for water? The Texas sun didn't care. Simply rose, burned, and set again, marking time in heat and harvest. And so, the experiment continued, field by field, acre by acre. An empire of fences, powered by human routine. The war had moved inside the wires, invisible but in a war built on destruction, this was the first front where survival was the only weapon left. By the end of that first winter, the war outside the wire had turned catastrophic for Germany. Stalingrad had fallen. Rome was burning. Hamburg lay in ruins. Inside the camps, word of defeat spread. Not through radios but through letters. Each one a slow fracture in the prisoners' sense of invincibility. They had arrived in Texas as soldiers of threat. They were becoming something else. Unanchored men suspended between guilt and gratitude. But ideology is stubborn, and even in captivity, it obeys its own arithmetic. Among the thousands at Camp Hearn were about 300 hardline Nazis, officers, party loyalists, believers in Hitler's final victory. They called themselves Die Schwarzen, the Blacks. They controlled information, intimidated moderates, and ran secret courts inside the camp. To them, surrender was treason and weakness was death. Every barrack became its own microcosm of the Reich. Maps of Europe were hand-drawn and updated with rumors. Hitler's portrait hung above makeshift altars. Men who questioned the